The International Monetary Fund has revised downward its growth projection for the global economy this year, warning that the world may fall into a recession if the oil crisis from the conflict in the Middle East is aggravated. Do stay with us. Hello and welcome. You're watching Press Perspective for this Wednesday, April 15th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. The International Monetary Fund has sounded the alarm over the broader economic fallout of the military conflict in the Middle East between the US and Iran. For more on this, I have freelance journalist Raphael Rashid here in the studio. Raphael, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
I also have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio with us. Steven, it's great to have you here.
Nice to be here. Thanks.
Raphael, we start with you. Let's begin with the IMF's concerns about the global economy amid the fallout from the conflict in the Middle East.
Sure. The IMF has slashed its global growth forecast to 3.1% for this year. And that's down from the 3.3% that it had projected just a few months ago before the conflict erupted, obviously. The IMF said that the world economy could have been upgraded to 3.4% if not for the war in the Middle East. So the conflict certainly has effectively shaved off 0.3 percentage points of these global prospects. The immediate trigger, of course, is surging prices for oil, gas, and also fertilizer after Iran virtually blocked traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, of course, and Trump ordering a naval blockade just this week. The IMF now expects inflation at 4.4% this year, up 0.6 percentage points from January. Actually, the IMF, they held a press conference yesterday, and the chief economist said that the global economy is technically more resilient than it was in the 1970s oil shocks during that period because we're far less dependent on oil, however, and also, of course, because there's renewables and nuclear energy. But that's only if the conflict doesn't last for too long. The IMF actually published different scenarios looking at the price of a barrel of oil in the short term, if it's maybe $82 per barrel or $100. And so they're looking at the different scenarios, and there's also the worst case scenario where they assume an extended conflict, oil prices averaging maybe $110 per barrel, maybe $125 next year, and then that, of course, would have results on growth collapsing, and the IMF noting that maybe this would be a close call for global recession. So many things to be concerned about. And maybe just one more point is that the emerging markets and developing economies are facing far more troubles, being more severely hit than the advanced economies.
Right. So as Raphael mentioned, Stephen, while the IMF lowered its growth outlook for the global economy to 3.1%, it left its outlook for the South Korean economy at 1.9%. What are your takeaways?
Well, there's a few things I think we could say. Like, one thing that I would flag is that the IMF says that if not for the conflict in the Middle East, global growth would have been revised upward due to a number of factors, one of which being a reduced burden from tariffs. And so that you can take that as a positive sign that the economic fundamentals are otherwise okay, but the if there is really doing a lot of work, because we do have this Middle East conflict, and there's very little sign of mitigation anytime soon. So when it comes to Korea, I just think we keep coming back to this scenario that, like Raphael just alluded to, of like, if this situation continues for very much longer, we're in pretty scary territory. So we've been seeing a pretty active response from the government, and I think that's something we can talk more about later. And domestic signs in Korea, things like job creation and a number of other indicators, have been actually fairly strong. And it seems like, at least thus far, the South Korean economy and advanced economies generally around the world are, at least to this point, weathering this reasonably well. But like, if we do get to a scenario where oil hits $110 or $120 a barrel, all bets are off, and we're heading up to a very consumption-heavy time of year in the summer when a lot of people travel, or a lot of people are driving longer distances. We could see some pretty big hits to various forms of discretionary spending, and that affecting things like seasonal employment in tourism and hospitality and a lot of other areas. So I hate to be so unoriginal, but it really does come down to just how long this conflict extends for. If we want to be optimistic, we would say that all of the involved policymakers from all of the sides would see that they have a common interest in resolving this, in easing inflationary pressures on their own electorates at home. At least one of the major players, the U.S., is a democracy, and the Trump administration on some level is going to be keeping public opinion in mind. The poll data that we have indicates that this conflict is not particularly popular in the U.S., so let's hope that those more dire scenarios do not come to pass.
Right, for sure. Raphael, in the meantime, what have been some of the latest ripple effects of the events unfolding in the Middle East here in South Korea? How high are the price of the pumps? How's the stock market faring? And what about the local currency?
Yeah, I mean, as you just mentioned, the economic shock is being felt on multiple fronts. And at the pumps, the price has crept steadily upwards despite government price caps. I think this morning the national average for petrol stood at 1,997 won per litre, just shy of the 2,000 won mark. In Seoul, it was a little bit more, already crossed that threshold to 2,027 won roughly, and diesel in similar territory nationally at 1,991 won per litre. The stock market too has been more volatile, but also might have shown a few signs of recovery. The Kospi closed just I think it was an hour and a half ago roughly, closed at nearly closed at 6,091 points. And then when it comes to the won did claw back a little bit, I think. This morning it opened at 1,471 won against the dollar after dropping a little bit. And I think the latest is about roughly 1,474. So it's I think gotten a little bit better. This rally is being driven by expectations, of course, that Washington and Tehran might return to the negotiating table over the next few days. I think the latest headlines we've seen is that it could happen in the next 2 days or so, in Pakistan, of course. But I think the underlying damage is, of course, severe. The Bank of Korea reported this morning that March import prices surged 16.1% months on months, and this, of course, is the steepest jump in around 28 years, driven almost entirely by oil. And then also similarly, crude import prices in won terms exploded in March. So still very uncertain times.
Right, and a lot of challenges here on the domestic front as well, of course. Stephen, that being said, what have been some of the more recent measures taken by the government to address these concerns?
Well, just a bit earlier today, the government announced that Chief of Staff Kang Hoon-sik had negotiated the acquisition of, I believe it was 273 million barrels of crude oil. I got to admit that I don't know exactly. I think that might be like a few months worth, or
3 months worth.
Yeah, it's hard to envision what 273 million barrels of anything looks like, or how that gets consumed and on what kind of a basis. But and he also said that he had just returned from a 3-nation trip to Saudi Arabia, Oman, and I believe it was Kazakhstan. Oh, excuse me, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Kazakhstan. And while he was there, he was meeting with a lot of people involved in the resource industries. And I think that's the kind of partial measure we're going to be seeing a lot of. Like, this is a problem that I think if it had an easy solution, we would have seen it already. There's just not, there's a reason that South Korea sources most of its oil from the Middle East, because there's not a easily accessible or affordable option with the kind of production capacity that a manufacturing power like South Korea needs. So I think a lot of people in the current government are going to be working around the clock to try to negotiate more deals, perhaps not of this size, because this is pretty big, but smaller, kind of more patching of the cracks kind of gestures. I know the government is also, in a meeting today, they talked about kind of longer term measures, such as like industrial restructuring, such as reducing reliance on plastic. I mean, those of us who live in this country know that there's a lot of plastic that gets consumed on a daily basis. Like I interviewed one restaurant owner a couple weeks ago who told me that every time he fills a takeout order, he has to include 5 different items of plastic in each order. And like as those prices are going up, that's cutting into his margins. And a silver lining interpretation of what's going on here maybe be that like this could provide a kind of motivation for the government to move towards policies that are much more like longer term in the country's interests generally, and could have like positive ripple effects. But that's all longer term stuff. And I think like the more immediate gestures are things like making sure that there are avoiding immediate energy shortfalls and just cushioning the blow on households. And to that end, the National Assembly, I think it was last week, passed a fairly large extra budget that provides some targeted supports to, I think it's 70% of the population, people in the lower income brackets. And so that will be needed as energy costs rise, as we see today in Seoul. We're already getting into weather where people might be turning on their air conditioners. So those household energy bills are going to need a bit of extra cash to help be covered. And so I think the government is, as always, I tend to say this a lot, the Korean government tends to be very attentive to these types of fluctuations in the economy, and it seems as though they are not sitting on their hands here.
Right, yeah, that's something you mentioned quite a bit while on the show with us. Raphael, over in the Middle East, the US blockade of ships to and from Iranian ports is reportedly in place. What has been revealed about this endeavor thus far?
Sure. So the U.S. Central Command announced on Monday that the blockade would be enforced against all vessels entering and departing all Iranian ports on the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. The ships traveling between non-Iranian ports through the Strait of Hormuz wouldn't be impeded, although I'm sure that they will encounter some difficulties in some form or another. At the beginning, I think Trump said on social media that this would affect any and all ships in the area, but then later on his own military did clarify that it was a bit more targeted, confined to Iranian ports rather than the entire waterway or passage. I think the implementation of this blockade is, I think it's quite challenging, but also quite intriguing how they're going to do this. Essentially, the US military hasn't exactly disclosed how many warships are going to be involved in this operation, although the Central Command did mention something in the lines of 12 warships and maybe 100 fighter and surveillance aircraft. So I mean, some military analysts believe that they're going to need at least 2 aircraft carriers in those waters, but then the actual mechanics of it, as I understand, will likely involve satellites and commercial intelligence to track these ships leaving Iranian ports and then intercepting them once they are out in the open waters in or around the Indian Ocean, away from Iran's missiles or drone range. And then in that situation, armed teams could basically intercept these ships, get on, take control. But of course, this does not come without risks. There are many analyses saying that this is quite a risky operation, and of course Iran does have mines. They do have small missile boats, surface and aerial drones, and also land-based cruise missiles that could potentially target US ships in those waters. So analysts are saying that this is at the end of the day, a very high-risk operation, because Iran could view this as a kind of sovereignty violation of the sorts, and could potentially trigger another local military conflict.
Right, indeed. Steven, let's also talk about the response to this latest US action by its partners across the globe. I believe China has condemned it as well. Could you tell us a bit more?
Yeah, China described it as irresponsible and dangerous, and I think their point was that this could undermine the already fragile ceasefire. And just as Raphael was just getting into a bit there, I mean, in this part of the world, we hear one phrase we hear a lot with military analysis is accidental clashes. Like whenever South Korea and the US hold military exercises, one line of analysis that gets brought up is that it's possible that someone on the North Korean side could misinterpret something that's happening, or be under the impression that a South Korean vessel has crossed a disputed border, or that they're shelling North Korean waters or North Korean territory or something, and that could spark a military conflict that nobody really wants. I see this scenario as having a lot of the similar dynamics at play. Like, what it just makes me think, as somebody who's not an expert on these things, like, there's got to be real jurisdictional issues here as to like whether or not anybody would recognize the legitimacy of this, or that if this is just a purely an exercise of force or of intimidation, how anybody will go about seeing that this goes ahead peacefully and that we can avoid making things worse. I mean, I guess just, as I alluded to, like the logic behind this is just that this is about power. This is just a kind of exercise of realpolitik in an already very tense and very fragile area. So it's something to be nervous about, which we have a lot of nowadays.
Right, which is why probably, Raphael, the UK, it was one of the first countries to criticize the US blockade. What was said and what was suggested instead?
Sure. The UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, he made it clear on Monday that Britain would not support the blockade and wasn't going to be dragged into the war. And I think he said that several times. And he said that the UK's focus was on keeping this waterway open, not closed. He also said that he would not be sending naval ships to support the US operation in the region. Also, there has been the UK and France who announced that they're going to co-host a video conference summit. I believe it's taking place on Friday, and they said that this would be to advance work on what they called coordinated, independent, multinational plan to safeguard the international shipping once the conflict ends. And actually, the French President Macron said that it would be for the countries prepared to contribute to this peaceful multinational mission, basically aiming at restoring the freedom of navigation in the strait. And he also said that this is a strictly defensive plan, separate from any warring parties. According to some diplomatic circles as well, Friday's talks will center on, again, championing freedom of navigation, pursuing possible maybe economic sanctions against Iran if the strait remains closed for a long period of time, and also securing the release, of course, of the trapped seafarers and ships in the area. I believe that they're basically stuck on the ships and also running out of food. So I think, there's a lot of diplomacy happening at the moment. And any mission, I think, could only happen once the conflict actually ends.
Right, for sure. And speaking about diplomacy, Stephen, over in the US, diplomats from Israel and Lebanon, they sat down for talks at the US State Department. What's the latest on that front?
The two sides were, struck a quite positive tone at the conclusion of these talks. On the Israeli side, it was the Israeli ambassador to the US who described the two sides as having a common interest in wanting to bring calm to this quite restive area, and both kind of sharing the view that Hezbollah, the Iranian-backed militant group that's quite active in Lebanon, is at a position where it has been weakened, in part because of the overall weakening of the Iranian government and just the kind of more general temperament in the Middle East, and that this represents an opportunity for the two sides to come to some kind of agreement and to bring peace to an area that's been, quite hotly disputed for a very long time. I would just note two things. I would just note that these are working level talks, so it's not as though they have the participants were reached any kind of binding agreement. And as we know, at least as far as we know right now, there is not a scheduled second round of talks. And I would just question when you have talks like this that are being led by government representatives, like, are they reflective of, or are they, kind of speaking on behalf of the people who live in these particular areas? Because in the Middle East and, around the world generally, but like a lot of times people who live in these disputed border areas feel quite strongly about, how the order in that place ought to be established and ought to be enforced, and they may not totally recognize the authority of the representatives of their government who are negotiating on their behalf. And so I would be a little bit skeptical as to, just how easy it would be to strike a lasting peace, but it is better to attempt to solve these things around the negotiating table than on a battlefield, so we can take some solace and encouragement from that.
Right. Quite a number of pundits do claim that the talks were largely symbolic, but then again, they were a step in the right direction. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. Stephen, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Raphael, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you very much.
Right, that brings us to the end of this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. Do join us again same time tomorrow, that is Thursday, for more panel discussion.